Hello, Forward Entanglements viewers. I am delighted to have you here again. My name is Rob Farley. I'm from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is a long-term contributor to Blogging Heads. He's been appeared here a number of times to talk about the stuff we're going to talk about today. It's Colin Snider. And remind me of your affiliation, Colin?
I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Texas at Tyler.
Texas at Tyler. So how are you doing today?
Doing all right. Been a busy, as every day is, busy day with the news.
No. Every hour is busy with the news. I mean, last week was insane, but it's interesting that you bring this up, right? Because here in the United States, we are sort of just absolutely committed to following the travails of, I think, our most exciting president. I don't think that anyone could really deny that, right? Where there's excitement, Donald Trump is number one, right? So. But while our president has been undergoing a series of self-created difficulties, it turns out I am to understand that the situation in Brazil is not nearly as settled as everyone had hoped that it would be after the impeachment of the last president. So can you fill us in on essentially what has happened since the impeachment of the previous president?
Sure. As briefly as I can. So, yes, Dilma Rousseff was impeached. It actually happened a year ago in this May. And then she was removed from office formally at the end of the summer. And her vice president, Michel Temer, became president. But he immediately became president under these auspices of corruption, this sort of ongoing massive corruption scandal that's been, or investigation that's been taking place for the last 3 years. And his cabinet was rife with, he had a number of early ministers stepping down because of their ties to corruption. And he's basically, with some congressional support, forced through some very unpopular austerity measures, things like freezing the health and education spending for the next 20 years, raising the retirement age, enjoying very low approval ratings, single-digit approval ratings, and people demanding that he step down basically since the moment he took office. And then in the last Friday, just as all the excitement was happening in the United States with regards to questions of obstruction of justice, there was a report in Brazil of the president of Brazil being involved in obstruction of justice. And so it sort of ratcheted up over the weekend as well in Brazil.
Now, so hopefully you can clarify this for me, right? I mean, it is commonly said, and I think it's largely accurate, that in the United States, impeachment is not a legal decision; it's a political decision, right? And so essentially, the ability to build a legal case against the president is basically irrelevant. It is relevant only insofar as it undermines support in the president's party, which then allows an impeachment and a conviction to go forward.
Right.
Now, that's what makes the situation in Brazil interesting to me, right? Because Temer becomes president because of a significant amount of disenchantment from particular social classes and the political class with Rousseff, right?
Yes.
And so Temer just squanders what he has immediately, or sort of how, like, is he losing strength from his own party, or is it cross-coalitional? What's going on?
It's cross-coalitional because Brazil is this weird beast that deals with presidential parliamentarism, because you have so many political parties since the end of the dictatorship that effectively, I know there's political scholarship or political science scholarship out there on whether in theory presidential parliamentarism can work, and then in practice can it work? Because basically what you have is a strong executive branch, but it has to form coalitions in Congress a la parliamentary system. And so and basically what we're dealing with here, it's not that he squandered the goodwill, it's that he never really had any to begin with, because so many people saw the impeachment as a corrupt practice itself. And we can come back to this later. It turns out that some people may have even offered congressmen were willing to take bribes to vote against impeachment on corruption, which is a rich irony. And the economy hasn't improved. The guy, Temer, he's not ever been really, I mean, he's been a congressman and a minister, but he's not really, he doesn't have the skill set needed for the kind of administrative specialty and skill in getting a program through Congress as the president. And the thing to keep in mind, too, is that he is representing a neoliberal austerity project that voters by a majority rejected in 2014 with the presidential elections. That, regardless of what the complaints about Rousseff were, one of the things that people have genuinely supported by and large has been sort of the social leveling and transformation that occurred first under Lula and then under her, and that there's still this sort of public resentment of neoliberalism, which had occurred in Brazil in the 90s and then sort of had been a facade, as it is in most of Latin America. So that even though she wasn't popular, it wasn't that they were demanding her removal because they wanted the imposition of these sort of economic reforms that he's imposing.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so he has ascended under sketchy in a sketchy situation. This unpopular with, if made up by maybe not a majority, but with a significant portion of the political class and the population at large. He is pushing a political project which is itself unpopular, and he's doing so not in a terribly competent way. Right? I mean, would that
right.
sort of
and he's also dealing with a Congress that's
thing.
got this massive cloud of corruption hanging over it, right? Because the corruption investigations going back to 2014 have pretty much implicated all members of all parties. Now, not all members of all parties, but members of all parties. And that Congress itself is really, it doesn't enjoy any support either. And even they have made missteps. So things like, even while they're imposing austerity programs on social safety nets, raising the incomes for federal employees, which didn't apply to the members of Congress, but did apply to the Supreme Court justices who are going to have to rule in these corruption hearings. So there's a lot of sort of, and this goes back to, you think, even of the protests in 2013, this massive sense of disconnect between Congress officials and the legislation they float versus what the public's demands are.
So, what are the next steps? I mean, what does this have? I think we did 2 or 3 episodes on Youssef, and I mean, you were very careful about tracking how we were going, but by the end, you were like, "This is going to happen, and she's going to be convicted." I mean, do we have a sense now of what things are looking like moving forward for Tamer?
We do, in the sense that it looks like chaos and it won't be resolved quickly. Because what happened was, so real quick, because the background here is important, the scandal that erupts on Friday is that there's this audio tape, or first on Thursday night, that there's this news story reporting that there's an audio tape of him meeting with a top, like an executive from the largest meatpacking company in the world, in which this executive, he says basically that we're paying off Eduardo Cunha, who had been the ringleader behind the impeachment of Youssef and was subsequently convicted on corruption and money laundering, and is now he was sentenced in March, and he's serving 15 years in prison. And the report was that there was this executive, his name is José Batista, that Batista alluded to providing payoffs to Cunha to keep him quiet, and that Tamer had approved it. But this was just a news report of this. And so there's this immediate, that this is blatant corruption on the part of Tamer has already been linked to corruption before, and that he's doing it as president. But then the audio tape was revealed and the transcripts. And Tamer said he's not going to resign. He's not going to step down, that this is a, persecution of him. And when we get the tapes and their quality is really terrible, and the transcripts, it's not clear that that's explicitly what's going on, but it's not clear that that's not going on either. And so Tamer had announced that he was going to, and as soon as this report happens, the Supreme Court announces that it will be investigating this case. And so he had asked them to halt the investigation because this is basically, a masterful, he goes after Batista on Saturday in this really fiery speech that doesn't actually address the substance of the claims against Tamer. It sort of portrayed Batista as this money laundering fiend. So he had asked the Supreme Court to shelve it until, saying that the audio is illegitimate. And today he withdrew that request. So it's, you've got people in the streets demanding his removal from office. They've been there before, but it's, it's a mess today. But the problem is his presidency ends next year. And he cannot run, by law, he cannot run for re-election because of a previous question of dubious use of campaign funds, that he wasn't allowed to run for public office for 8 years. So he can't run for office. So there's going to be elections next year, whether he's impeached or not.
So well, then what's the point? I mean, why would people put together sort of an aggressive impeachment push at this point, right? I mean, I feel maybe I'm looking at it with U.S. eyes, right, and sort of that like it would be very difficult.
There's the question of the rule of law, that no one can be above the rule of law, and that this does seem to be a case, that this could be a case of obstruction of justice if he's trying to pay off the congressman who could perhaps implicate him. His general unpopularity, his failure, his efforts to ram through, a program that's not enjoying support, the sense that he was never legitimate to begin with. And he doesn't help himself in any way, shape, or form. So he'll say things like, he hasn't been given a chance to clean up the corruption of the previous administration that was removed from office last year. And that's fine if he had been outside of it, but he's the vice president of that administration. In fact, he's still facing investigations that he could be removed from office because he was a member of that group that was allegedly corrupt within the previous administration. So it's just so uncertain that he may be president through the end of this term. I'm very confident saying he will not be an effective president if he makes it to the end of the term. And you have the Brazilian Lawyers Association filing for impeachment. You have some congressmen, filing for impeachment now. The Supreme Court's investigating the case. So it's a lot. I mean, what's going to happen in the next year? It will be chaos, and it's so fast paced. It's tough to say in some ways. Like even right before we talked, I was looking, and just within the last half hour or so, Lula has been denounced for money laundering and could be facing trial. And he was going to run for president next year. And currently in the polls, he's leading with 30%. And second place is people filling null or blank votes. So that's sort of where Brazilian politics is right now, is that people are fed up with everyone.
So what kind of real world impact has the last 2.5 years of uncertainty really had, right? So this is in terms of, when we think about it, especially, like the United States, right? I mean, imagine a president who was completely incapable of doing something. But we've had this situation where there's been this dark cloud. What impact has that had on governance in Brazil? Do the wheels keep turning otherwise? I mean, or...
No and yes. Not in the way that they did under Lula or under his predecessor, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and not in the ways they did under the military dictatorship for obvious reasons. But there's still, the government can still try to, there's so many branches of government. I mean, the Constitution's in 1988, so it's a massive document that there's plenty of ways that, I don't want to say that they've gone rogue or it's sort of some sort of deep state, but that aside from leadership, the bureaucratic wheels can continue turning. Now, there is uncertainty in areas like economic policy, or, what the last 2.5 years have basically done is shown, in a perverse way, it's almost had a beneficial outcome in revealing, like, everyone suspected corruption. It's revealed how systemic it is, that this isn't a question of partisan politics, that it's across the board. And, if I may quote the Dark Knight, the night is always darkest before the dawn. So this could be sort of this kind of reckoning. It's not guaranteed to occur, but corruption and an improvement in electoral politics in Brazil cannot happen without a reckoning with this systemic corruption. And that's at least becoming more naked.
Now, has this? I'm sort of fascinated. The way that things have played out in the United States with respect to our own presidential problems, and sort of in comparison to Brazil, is not at all, because nobody has any idea what's going on in Brazil. Is there any sort of is anybody in Brazil sort of making a cultural or a political connection between the sort of thing that's happening in the United States, where you have what people are interpreting as this populist revolt against established elites and so forth, to sort of what's going? Is there any kind of belief that that this is all some sort of wave that is connected with Brexit and connected with other the election of Trump and so forth, right? Where sort of the established ways of doing things are being torn to pieces.
Yeah, I've seen some people commenting on that, but I think it's a little lazy that they point to one of the people who could be a key figure in next year's election. His name is Jair Bolsonaro. He made waves with the impeachment because he dedicated his impeachment vote to the torture of Dilma, of Rousseff, right? That he had sort of celebrated, and he had been in the military during the dictatorship, very low ranking, but he celebrates the dictatorship, thinks it was a good thing. He's a sort of evangelical right wing. That he actually faced censor on the floor of the Congress because he'd said that one of his female colleagues was too ugly to rape, and he's sort of charged with these misogynistic claims, and it was upheld, and so he's censored for it. So he is sort of this right-wing extremist who resonates with people wanting order, and sort of the good old days of the dictatorship is what that's kind of a code for. But he would be third behind null and blank votes if the election were held today. He's got about 15%. But he terrifies a lot of people. So it's not in the sense of the United States or Brexit where it's like these 2 or 3 major parties and we're fed up with them and we want someone who's sort of outside that system. It's more getting beyond the major parties in Brazil to look to other parties. So this is why you're seeing a rise in evangelical parties, seeing a rise in some leftist parties that sort of broke with the PT many years ago. They're turning to alternative parties that are perhaps not, or not turning to, but this is an opening for alternative parties that are established, but have not been the draw of the 3 major parties of the PSDB, the PT, and the PMDB.
Have people have sort of in the popular press or culturally, sort of beyond this idea of whether there's really a populist wave, have there been people making parallels between Trump and Tamer or anything along those lines? Right? Is this something you would find on the
Um,
editorial page or an
Not
editorial
really.
cartoon?
Yeah, not really, in part because of how they came to office
Oh.
each. I mean, the closest parallels, weirdly enough, that I saw, and this was last year when Tamara came into office, was
Hmm.
with their wives. That they both have married much younger with these sort of glamorous women who seem to be happy to accept some degree of domesticity. That
Hmm.
one magazine faced a lot of flack for celebrating Tamara's wife for being at home and doing her domestic duties as a woman should. So that's sort of the only place where I've really seen sort of the Trump to Mayor comparisons. And
Hmm.
there's been a lot of observation lately, like, oh, wait, you guys have obstruction of justice? We have obstruction of justice. Wow, this is all happening on the same day. But yeah, that's about the limit of the parallel. It's more of what a coincidence rather than Tamara and
Right,
Trump
right,
are
right,
secretly a lot alike. Yeah.
right. No, that's fascinating. So how about we jog, a little bit to the north,
Hmm.
and talk about the other crisis point in Latin America that is well known to American readers, right?
Sure.
And by I mean well known to American readers, I mean well known to the few who follow Latin American politics extensively.
Right.
Um, uh, so, I mean, I want to feel like we are in sort of roughly the 14th year of crisis in Venezuela, and I understand that crisis has
Hmm.
waned and waxed, and
Right.
we really do seem to be in a waxing point right now for the crisis of Maduro and his administration. Although maybe that's tailed off in the last couple of weeks, it's hard for me exactly to
Well, no,
say. But
it's actually worsening, I think.
okay.
So where we are is it's your waxing observation. It's waxing more than it has waxed before, I would say.
Hmm.
That and it really begins at the end of March, where the Supreme Court decides to strip the National Assembly of its power. The Supreme Court will incorporate those powers into its own institution, which is
Hmm.
hugely problematic because the National Assembly is the one place where the opposition politicians have a majority voice,
Hmm.
where they have a powerful voice in the government because the Supreme Court had been appointed either by Chavez or by Maduro since then.
Hmm.
And obviously Maduro is representing the Chavista state in the executive. So the legislative had been this one sort of legitimate and the most directly elected institution that had an opposition within it.
Hmm.
And so the moment the Supreme Court does this, there's, and that was about 50 days ago, there's extreme anger and people take to the streets. And within 3 days, the Supreme Court sort of walks away from that. But since that point, then there have been protests in the streets. You've had about 45 people, I think was the last number I saw, dead
Hmm.
in these protests. And it's not real clear who's killing whom. It's, sometimes it's government forces. Sometimes it seems to be private forces. Both are willing to say they all fall to the other side, so that it's just, at that point, you can't really necessarily count on anybody.
Hmm.
But you have then, opposition leaders calling for people to take the streets. You have the Maduro government saying that such calls are inciting violence. Inflation is expected to be over 700%. That there's no, they're having a hard time getting food, getting medicine, that there's a growing
Hmm.
refugee crisis, so that estimates for refugees to Colombia are between 140,000 and 900,000, and they're also spilling over into Brazil. The opposition leader, Enrique Capriles, claims that his passport was taken away and won't be returned to him until 2020, and he's about
Hmm.
to go visit the International Commission on Human Rights. You have Maduro calling for a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, that he's extended the state of economic emergency, which grants him extra powers, and that extension adds on to 60 days. So there's this really fierce struggle going on over the question of the role of the opposition
Hmm.
and the state and the economy in Venezuela.
Right. So, I mean, is there any light at the end of the tunnel economically, right? I mean, just from my own knowledge of how, and sort of a growing understanding of what the real structure of the international oil market is, right?
Mm.
It's hard, regardless of what Russia or Saudi Arabia decide to do, it's hard to project a reality in which there are substantial increases in oil prices in the near future,
Yeah.
right? So that seems like a hard ceiling for
Right.
for the for the regime, for the administration at this point, for the Venezuelan government at this
Yes.
point. And my understanding is still that, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the industry, but that they are continuing to have infrastructure problems and sort of strategic reinvestment problems and so forth,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, is there any economic scenario in which we don't just see more constriction of the Venezuelan economy? Is there any kind of light at the end of the tunnel?
I don't see one in the immediate future, and I confess that there may be more on this that I'm not aware of. But I think one of the things that we're finally being able to see is sort of the long-term legacies of the Chavez administration. That because for so many years while it was going on, it was either, you were either completely in favor of him or completely opposed to him, and there's no real room for a discussion of a middle ground. But the building on the oil industry was fine, but the problem was it sort of vilified, and I'm not saying these vilifications are necessarily unjustified, but sort of vilified the U.S. and foreign oil companies and the elites within Venezuela. And that works well, and when the oil industry was doing well in the 2000s, it allowed him to have these kinds of social programs that some people are still very much in favor of, right? That Maduro does have supporters because he represents the Chavista government, and that created things like health programs and whatnot. What that money didn't do, though, is it appears it didn't nearly work towards areas like education for diversifying the economy or reinvesting in other sectors beyond oil. So that, to bring us back to your original question, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? It would appear not anytime soon because the economy is so terrible and there hasn't been that long-term establishment of alternatives for the Venezuela. Like that basically they did well on oil alone without, and I'm not saying investing in things like healthcare or education were bad, but the failure to invest in things like education for non-oil production in other areas, it seems to be is a growing issue.
Right. Well, this is not a problem just for Venezuela, right? I mean, this is a problem for every sort of resource-rich country, and even for every oil country, right? It's the problem that Russia has really found, that it is exceedingly difficult to diversify an economy when one's economy is so dependent upon oil, right? For various, exchange rate problems, human capital problems, right? I think the human capital problems are probably even more difficult in Venezuela because sort of the human capital is concentrated in the opposition. So, I guess to reiterate something I've said before, you cannot build the revolution upon a giant pool of hydrocarbons, right? It just doesn't. Just doesn't. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable, right? Which is something perhaps Scotland has come to a better understanding of after it failed in its independence bid. But that seems bad. I mean, that doesn't seem good at all, right?
And so, I mean, I don't see any immediate outcome. Maduro is theoretically president at least until 2019, and he said he's not going to step down. And what's interesting, too, is that, quite frankly, the opposition had never really made a compelling case as to why they should be in power. Like, just the other guy's terrible, but when you have, over a decade of social programs that improve the lives of the majority of the population, you're going to have to do more than we don't like him and you shouldn't either. And so what's interesting is with the Supreme Court move a couple months ago, this is the first time the opposition has actually kind of had a broader support for this message of the critiques it has, or that it's levying now against Maduro that hadn't been there before. But in terms of is there an out anytime soon? I sure don't see one.
Right, and so even if we can sort of imagine this next reality, and I don't know what kind of scenarios there are for a sudden or not so sudden Maduro. My understanding is the military is unlikely to step in. That unless there's some sort of Egypt like drive against him. But is there? Let's dump Maduro, right? And then the next step is some, not really broadly popular opposition figures who are pretty problematic in their own right and are associated with a lot of negativity, right?
But it may not even be opposition, because the other thing to keep in mind, too, is it's not like the Chavistas are a unified bloc, right? That and we don't get a good glimpse of this, but there are occasionally these sort of little, rays of light shining through the fog that suggest some of the internal politicking behind that there may be, in terms of outs, I'm not saying it's probable or likely, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that Maduro were overthrown by Chavistas within the military, because they, the sort of notion that maybe he's led them astray and that they'll fix this, right? And you could sort of have a replication then of, let's say, Peru in 1968, where the military steps in to launch this kind of social reformist dictatorship rather than a right-wing dictatorship like its counterparts in Chile and Argentina and Brazil in the 60s and 70s. So, it's not that if Maduro were to be overthrown, quite frankly, I think it's more likely that it'd be from a group of Chavistas than from the opposition, because they don't have the like at this point the military is pretty firmly Chavista. They worked with him, they were by his side. That was his background, so that if there were an overthrow, anything short of a civil war, it seems more likely that it would be from pro-Chavistas who feel that the path has been, he's gone away from the path, rather than from opposition leaders who then put one of their own in.
I mean, is there a possibility?
Like we went to see 2002, basically, with when sort of the coup that failed in Venezuela.
Right. So, I mean, is there any possibility out there for some sort of coalition government? Right. I mean, is the partisan situation so dreadful at this point that sort of a broad coalition government is basically unimaginable in the wake of Maduro? Or?
Yeah. Like I don't think we're looking at sort of Ortega in Nicaragua and in the 1980s, late 80s. Like I think because the opposition has done such a poor job of framing what their program is, other than we're not Chavez and Maduro, and that's not compelling. And enough people are still, again, that there have been I don't want to detract from this, that there have been very real improvements in the quality of life for a lot of people in the long run under the government of Chavez and then by extension Maduro. So this isn't a thing where it's not Brazil where everyone's fed up with everyone in power and they want to try something different. That there are those who, it still draws on public support in considerable numbers.
Right. To take a sort of larger lens here, and to sort of drag us back to the United States a little bit, and you can feel free to comment as broadly or as narrowly as you would like on this. So thus far, apart from, I suppose, blatherings about NAFTA and for the death of the TPP, which did include several Latin American countries, how sort of is pan-Latin America, how would you characterize the pan-Latin American reaction to the emergence of the Trump administration, right? Is everybody sort of happy he's paying attention to somewhere else right now, or is there, in the Middle East it's quite excited, right? And in East Asia there's been a number of differential reactions. In Europe, raw terror, right? I mean, how does Latin America fit into that
There's
puzzle?
been some. I mean, this is going to seem a little contradictory, but when we get to the pan level, it's not pan Latin American level. It's not so much this question of is there this kind of right resurgence that maybe the United States and England are a part of, because you're seeing, that Mauricio Macri winning in Argentina, and he's a more conservative figure. That Sebastián Piñera is running for election next year in Chile, and he's currently leading the polls there. So there's this question of sort of. Even Peru, where they had their elections, and you're basically dealing with the daughter of Alberto Fujimori in a runoff with a former neoliberal politician, and those are your two choices. There's no real radicalism there.
Looks like France. Sounds like France.
Yeah. So that there is a sort of questioning among some of the scholarly community about, like, is this, where does might this fit within this broader Western trend of this appeal to right-wing-ish populism? There's definitely a sense of horror at the Trump administration, I think, because of sort of the racist paintbrush that he's drawing with, right? These broad strokes regarding people like Mexico, or it's sort of, I'd say, replicating what much of the rest of the world is equal parts horror, disbelief, and bemusement. That you could have like, oh, the situation in Venezuela is bad. Like that's your bold statement on Venezuela. Wow. That there's sort of a, that. This is a bad look for the United States and the international community. I mean, that's not news to anybody. And Latin, I don't think they fear having their own Trump. Some of them do sort of see some parallels with some people. Or, it does lead to some in the region more generally saying, well, I could be president of my country if he can do it.
Yeah, because I was born with that much money and I could parlay it into slightly less money over the course of...
I wouldn't say there's as much fear as there was under someone like Reagan or Bush, where the concern was they really were going to try to put their efforts into addressing the inter-American relations, because historically that hasn't worked out well for Latin America, and the sort of, in hindsight, relief in the wake of Bush's war on terror, where his attention was diverted and Latin America actually had this kind of boom decade. I think there's sort of the sense that Trump he's not knowledgeable enough and not going to pay much attention to the region. And it doesn't help even that one of the top-ranking officials in his government on Latin America was forced out basically in disagreement with Tillerson, like sort of behind the scenes.
Who was that?
I forget his name now. I was just reading about him this afternoon too, so this is mildly embarrassing. But he there's not a strong sense of stability or akin to Trump failing to address most of the issues. The failure to appoint numerous positions that are typically filled by now. These kinds of issues make it so that Latin America is not so, there's not a real perceived threat. I'm seeing if I can't find that number here while I'm on a computer here real quick for you. But yeah, that's sort of the, I would say there's not, what worries there are more just what is this man going to do in the world, and not so much what's he going to go do with us.
Right. So, right. And
Rick Waddell, that's his name, Rick Waddell.
Right. I mean, there are not a lot of presidents who come into the office in the United States with what appear to be an avowed intention to tear down the U.S.-built system of global hegemony, right? I mean, this is sort of an unusual thing from an American president, right? And so even if he's not doing something specifically with regards to Latin America, are there any? I mean, can you characterize any regional differences, right? Are the Central America versus the Cone versus Brazil, or so?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, because issues, and this sort of. The issues don't transcend time, but this kind of regional, Central America and Mexico, by default of being closer to the United States, are also, it looms larger there. But also the areas that the United States since 1991 have really targeted, issues like the drug trade, that those are far different. There's no worry about the war on drugs in Brazil or Argentina or Chile or Paraguay, so that the presence of the United States sort of in that Caribbean sphere where there is drug production, Colombia and Central America, and the subsequent, another issue, migrants, right? The migration of people from Honduras, El Salvador, through these sort of violent societies, often spurred by, U.S. role going back to the 1980s. You're not having, no one's worried about a wave of Chileans coming in across the border from Mexico. There is this...
Well, Chile has built its economic policy around the idea of sort of close free trade interaction with the United States, right? So that has to be problematic in some sense.
Yes. But the presence of the United States then, and the Latin American relationship with the United States is sort of this regional thing, because in places like Central America, it's going to be more dependent upon questions of the drug trade, migration, et cetera. In places like Chile, it's going to be more economic policy at a more abstract question of liberal economics.
Right.
And with Brazil, it's like, well, it could have been a huge trading partner, but having its own economic issues now, and sort of slowed, stagnant economy, and not a lot of foreign investment going in.
Right. It did occur to me. I was about to mention when, with respect to Venezuela, I know we've skipped past that now. I suppose I have seen in a few places that the last hope for Venezuela is China as an angel investor, right? That there'll be Chinese money flowing in somehow. Massive Chinese loans that will somehow rescue the revolution, which seems optimistic.
Yeah, definitely, especially since, to my knowledge, the biggest issue that China's sort of facing internally might be lack of food. And if your sole economic production is oil, well, that's not going to, you're not going to eat that. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I don't know. Is there anything else you would like to say before we go?
No, I could probably go on about the Brazilian corruption for another half hour. Who knows what's happened since we started talking?
Right, know. Yeah.
It is really fascinating because the other thing, I'll sort of close on this. What's interesting from the social perspective is the number of sort of conservatives who insisted that the PT was entirely corrupt and they had to go last year. Those are the people in the streets last year. And it turns out that Aécio Neves is also implicated in this. He'd been the presidential candidate against Rousseff in 2014 and lost in a close election, and it insisted she was completely corrupt. And he's also come up in these recordings, right? That you have the federal police involved in these recordings. And he's asking for $2 million in bribes for sort of a slush fund, and that there's someone who's leaving his house with suitcases full of money. And this is all happening at the same time where, the federal government's now slashing funding to the federal police, specifically the federal police working on this investigation into corruption. So who knows? It's it'd almost be comedic if it weren't so deeply embedded and systemic as to genuinely affect governance, economics, and everyday life in Brazil.
So is there a wave to clean this out, or is it just keep your head down until the corruption narrative isn't as compelling anymore?
I think we might be past the point of no return on the corruption narrative not being compelling, because it's 8 of Temer's ministers are connected to the corruption hearings. Numerous Congress people are. So I think that wave isn't. there may come a time where they're no longer worried about, like, so if he's, the classic phrase for a Brazilian, Sao Paulo governor and mayor back in the 50s and 60s was, he robs, but he gets things done. Maybe if they start getting things done again while robbing, that would go away. But for now, I think this is going to be an issue. I mean, it'll be really fascinating to see the 2018 elections, presidential and congressional, in terms of how do people run, who runs, who's gaining votes. Last year, or a couple months ago, we had the municipal elections where it was compelling that in almost every big city in Brazil, null or blank votes would have won or finished second in every election. So it'll be curious to see how does that play out at the national level, and if there's anyone who sort of steps in who's not so connected to all of this corruption, who can kind of sweep people off their feet.
All right. Well, I can only imagine that we will be here to have that conversation when that happens. So
yeah, sounds good.
Well, thank you so much, Colin, and thank you. For Entanglements viewers for joining us tonight, and we will be delighted to have you again soon.
I welcome the opportunity.
All right.